Welcome to this De Morgan collection talk on the theme of Made in Chelsea, the De Morgans' lives and work in the London borough of Kensington and Chelsea. When we talk about Chelsea, this is what we mean today. This is the area of London we're talking about. So just north of the River Thames, opposite Battersea. It's Battersea Park right down there in the bottom right-hand corner that you can see as a sort of glint of green. It's not a particularly large area of London, but it's one in which the De Morgans treasured and lived there for their whole married lives. Here is a picture of a map from 1901. So this is about the time that we're talking. Not a very good reproduction, I'm afraid, but you can see that the boundary line is about the same. If you can see my cursor, it's this one here. In the top right-hand corner, a dotted line, and this is Battersea Park opposite the river again that we've just seen on the Google Maps. So it's within this area of London. Like I said, that the De Morgans lived their whole married lives, which was from 1887 through to Evelyn De Morgan's death in 1919, William De Morgan, her husband, having passed away 2 years earlier than her in 1917. And so this talk's going to take us through both of their lives in Chelsea, starting a little bit earlier than the marriage with William De Morgan, whose artistic practice, his journey began in Chelsea with his ceramics in 1872. So here's a picture of Cheney Row. De Morgan lived in what was then number 8 Cheney Row, which would have been about here. So the house with the plaque on just next to the house with the columns was Thomas Carlyle's house, and that was at number 5 Cheney Row. So 2 doors down from that, we had William De Morgan's home at number 8. He moved there in 1872 from rented accommodation that he had on Fitzroy Square. That's where he'd been living previously, and that's where he first began his ceramic practice. Unfortunately for him, his experiments in ceramic making led to him blowing up the kiln in his rented accommodation, and obviously the landlord asked him to move out, which he had to do pretty swiftly. So did what was available to him as a poor artist, which was to move back in with his mum. His father had recently passed away, so that was probably a secondary reason for him to choose to go back home, and his mother was living at the time on Cheney Row in Chelsea with his sister Mary. As I mentioned, Thomas Carlyle was probably the most famous resident of the street when De Morgan lived there, and you can still, in normal times, visit Carlyle House at number 5 Cheney Row. That's now owned by the National Trust. But these images sort of give us a little bit of an insight of what it might have been like from 1872 when De Morgan lived there. So you can see that these are beautiful 3-storey with a basement houses, but very domestic in scale and layout, with drawing rooms, sitting rooms, and then a kitchen downstairs, probably with domestic staff. Even though the De Morgans weren't particularly wealthy, William's father had been a professor of mathematics at University College London, and the family were comfortable enough off to probably have those domestic staff who would have lived downstairs. This is an example of one of the earliest tiles that De Morgan would have made at Chelsea. As we've seen, the domestic scale and size of the homes there meant that De Morgan was creating designs only, really, during this period. He didn't have the staff or space available to him in order to make the ceramic vessels or to design them or to make his own tiles. So this is a hippocamp, wonderful mythological creature, this play on a seahorse with this beautiful nautical looking horse there. But you can see the hand painting in this tile as well. That's very much what the tile was brought in to do. So it's on a Dutch blank tile and painted with this very kind of comical, really personable animal design that we know De Morgan so well from. But he was very much restricted in this period by the domestic size and layout of his home. We've seen Carlyle's house. This is actually the interior of William De Morgan's home on Cheney Row, which he lived with his mother, Sophia De Morgan, and sister Mary De Morgan. And you really get a sense here that it's not an ideal space to be running a pottery from. Apparently, the staff who worked for him would work on the upper floors in the attic rooms of this house. You can see the beautiful original panelling for the house still exists. I managed to get these pictures from Rightmove, actually, as the house went up for sale in 2016, which gives us this wonderful insight into the size and space of the house. But what I thought in looking at this first floor room, which you can see at the upper right of the slide, is that actually a lot of light comes through into those upper rooms. So actually they probably weren't bad for transferring De Morgan designs onto the tile surfaces in, and probably quite comfortable for the number of staff De Morgan had during this period. But it really, I think, gets to the heart of the arts and crafts movement, and that idea of the socialism behind it, and that people would have great pride in their work, look after each other, and that it was a real artistic community. And being a neighbour of Thomas Carlyle, of course, the great socialist, probably helped with that. We know De Morgan was in touch with Carlyle. Being neighbours during this period means that was probably inevitable, that great sense of community that streets like this would have had. But we also know from William Morris, it was recollections of knowing De Morgan, that when he was setting up the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, or SPAB as it's still known today, he had tried to coerce William De Morgan to get Carlyle to join, of which he was not successful. So we know that De Morgan was, I think, quite interested and involved in SPAB himself, but couldn't quite get Carlyle to sign up. De Morgan during this time was known by a lot of his friends as Mouse. I think he had quite a quiet demeanour about him, very different to the bravado of William Morris. And so I sort of get the picture that De Morgan might have been quite sort of bullied almost by Morris to go and coerce Carlyle into joining, and that maybe his heart wasn't quite in it as he nervously asked the great man to join up to this business. We also have wonderful recollections in the biography written by William De Morgan's sister-in-law, Wilhelmina Sterling, of De Morgan's time in Chelsea on Cheney Row. And Morris again features heavily in that. So apparently he would pound his way up those stairs, shouting "Bill" at the top of his voice, which is how he knew De Morgan. According to another source, which is Reginald Blunt, who was De Morgan's one-time business manager, in his book A Wonderful Village, which is about the history of pottery in Chelsea, once Morris had reached the top of those stairs, he'd sort of have a look around at what they'd been painting, take a selection of the best pottery for himself to sell in his own showroom, and leave the rest behind for De Morgan. So a real sort of lovely anecdotal situation and sources that we have there that reference this area of Chelsea as being one that's quite dynamic, this wonderful home set up with the workers and staff and other arts and craftsmen and other notable people of the time coming in and out, and it being quite a fluid and dynamic space to create in. Another creative that we can't leave out of this discussion of William De Morgan's early years in Chelsea is his sister Mary. And in 1877, she published her first book of fairy tales on a pincushion. It's a charming story in which a brooch, a hat pin, and a tie pin have been left for the day on a pincushion. And in order to pass the time, the three pieces of jewellery tell each other fairy stories. It really is a brilliant read, and I've actually had a look at some of these during the lockdown and revisited them, and if you can get your hands on a copy, they do read very well. And De Morgan was instructed by Mary and by her publisher to create these woodblock prints for the interior pages, which is there on the left, one from the story of the Vain Lamorna, and to create the decoration and the design for the embossed leather cover of his sister Mary's book. So we have examples there of other work that De Morgan was doing during this time at Chelsea. In 1877, so the same year as On a Pincushion was published, we have De Morgan, he was enlisted by the architect George Aitchison to install Lord Leighton's collection of Damascene tiles that he'd collected on his travels through the Middle East into the new Arab Hall extension of his home close by, but in the same borough, but in Kensington. It's still there today, just by Holland Park. And so from winning this wonderful commission, De Morgan had a lot of experience of working firsthand with these amazing cool blue and turquoise tiles. And as we saw in the hippocamp, this colourway really influenced the tiles he made during this time at Chelsea. But there we go, another resident of the borough who was very influential. Lord Leighton, of course, went on to be president of the Royal Academy and a great influence on both of the De Morgans and many in their circle. You really see that influence in designs such as the Mongolian patterned tile, which De Morgan produced in Cheney Row. And there on the left-hand side, just next to it, we have a reproduction of a catalogue of painted tiles, which De Morgan used to advertise his wares and sell them. Now, the house itself wasn't big enough to have the showroom in as well. And by 1880, De Morgan had taken out number 36 Cheney Row, which was at the end of the block his house was on, in order to have that commercial space available and to be able to sell the tiles, as well as to be able to have the space to decorate them. So the whole street was eventually involved by the 1880s. De Morgan stayed and working and living in Cheney Row until 1882. At this point, he took out premises for his factory at Merton Abbey near Wimbledon, which was another site that Morris already had premises on. And really, it was from that and to do with just the fact that he didn't have the space on Cheney Row to expand his business in the way he wanted to, which with De Morgan was always in the direction of creativity rather than in the direction of finance. Meaning that he wanted the space to create larger, more ambitious ceramic forms, vases and plates, and that really is why the move to Merton happened. But he stayed living on Cheney Row with his mum and his sister until his marriage to Evelyn de Morgan, which we'll come on to shortly. Just round the corner from Cheney Row on Cheney Walk, so facing the river, if you cast your mind back to the maps we looked at the start and down to the lower left-hand side of that image of the map that I showed you, it was Turner's house, which he lived in until his death in 1851. Again, quite an unassuming house, but you can see it's got the top balcony there and these, again, big windows, wonderful for painting in. Obviously, Turner had passed away by the time De Morgan moved into the area. So whilst that artistic legacy was there, there wasn't actually any creativity. But I wanted to draw your attention to these buildings because this and many others along Cheney Walk were actually redeveloped by the designer and architect C.R. Ashby, who was very well known in the arts and crafts movement for his designs. He came a little bit later than De Morgan, but he redeveloped a lot of the houses along there in order to make them studio homes. So that was something quite exciting, very artistic, that was going on in this area at the same time that De Morgan lived there. Another incredibly noteworthy resident of Cheney Walk. Again, another 5-minute walk from De Morgan's house on Cheney Row, which runs perpendicular to it. Cheney Walk faces outwards onto the river, was Dante Gabriel Rossetti, one of the founder members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was established in 1848 at another of the Brotherhood's houses at Millet's parents' house up in North London. But Rossetti lived in this absolutely beautiful house on Cheney Row, again with his family, including his brother William Michael Rossetti. Of course, was one of the other founding members of the Brotherhood. He was an art critic and poet. But it's not just likely, it's certain that De Morgan would have known of Rossetti working around the corner. There's not a lot of documentary evidence that shows off what the relationship between Rossetti and De Morgan were, other than we can be certain that through other connections that the two of them had, they would have been aware of each other's work and practice. And Rossetti lived at Cheney Row until his death in 1885. So he was around, he was living there at the same time around that De Morgan was also living on the street just round the corner. And of course, Rossetti, being very much a part of those artistic circles and artistic hubs, meant that other people were also visiting his house and the area. So the two people in the top of the picture there are Dante Gabriel Rossetti on the left and his brother William Michael Rossetti on the right. And then the other two characters sort of sitting and looking out of us in that charming photograph taken at number 16 Cheney Walk are the poet Charles Algernon Swinburne in the bottom left, and one of Rossetti's models, Fanny Cornforth, is the woman in the wonderfully plush gown there staring out at us from the garden at 16 Cheney Walk. So we've got these people in and out of the neighbourhood walking around around. And they're just some of a few of the many artists that took to this area from the 1880s in order to call it home. From 1884, Evelyn Pickering, Miss Pickering there in the middle, crossed out and later amended to Mrs. de Morgan after her marriage to William in 1887, is Evelyn Pickering. And this picture that I'm showing you is a page from an account book that she had an account with the art monger, dealer of canvases and paints and brushes, who was very well used by the wider Pre-Raphaelite circle, called Robeson. And Robeson, thankfully for us, kept this meticulous list of everything that every artist who had an account with him had ever bought, how much he owed them, when it had been paid, what dates and years, and most importantly, where the artists lived, so an address for them. Probably for him, just sort of good bookkeeping sense, but for us, a wonderful insight into where the artists moved around. And so many artists moved around and lived with other people and rented spaces that they're very difficult to pin down in a census. But this account book gives us a very clear idea of when and where they were living. And when I sort of recently examined these books, I was absolutely delighted to see that we have the inscription here, 8 Trafalgar Studios, just to the right-hand side of the big Miss Pickering title in the Robeson's account books. What this does is pin Evelyn's practice right into the centre of artistic Chelsea from very early in her career. Evelyn Pickering had been born in London. She was born in 1885. She trained at the National Art Training School and then went on to the Slade School of Art as one of its first pupils. So the Slade was established in 1871, and by 1873, Evelyn had enrolled. It was an amazing art school for many reasons. One of them was that it admitted women on the same terms as men and allowed women to draw from the life model, draw from the nude, almost. If you were a woman in the life classes, you had to draw from a chap with a big nappy on, essentially. And after 5 p.m, absolutely no women in the life room either. But still, that was progression compared to the other art schools that wouldn't even allow women to enter at that time. Evelyn finished her time at the Slade in 1876 and began exhibiting and selling paintings successfully immediately after her departure from the school, which was quite phenomenal, again, for such a young woman. She was 20 at the beginning of her career. By 1884, she'd been working as an artist for some time. Whether she'd taken out rent on Trafalgar Studios before 1884, we can't be exactly sure, because this is the only record of her time there that I have managed to locate. But we know from at least 1884, she had this studio at Trafalgar Studios in Chelsea. Now, as I've said, that really does mean something. This area of Chelsea was booming. By the 1881 census, 9 in 1,000 people had listed their occupation as artist. So really quite a large portion of the population of Chelsea was registered as an artist. During this time. And here we have a picture of Tite Street in around 1880. This was a huge artistic hub just around the corner from the places we've been looking at so far. And I keep saying that, but that's because everything is literally all within that tiny area of London that I'd shown you on the map at the start. Try and stop saying around the corner from one place to the next, but they literally are streets apart. So here we have a set of studios that were developed and built in the 1880s on Tite Street for the use by artists. And again, you'll see these lovely big windows in them to allow the light to come in. These were, the idea behind them was that they would offer accommodation and studio space in one room. So that's where we get the idea of a studio flat that we still think of today. One room, kitchen, bathroom facilities, bedroom, and for artists, space to have an easel, workshop, and to paint as well. So some really notable artists took out space on Tite Street, including John Singer Sargent. There we have his rooms, 31 to 33 Tite Street in Chelsea. And this is from about the time that these were established, so from about 1880. Just just around the corner, on Manresa Road is where Trafalgar Studios were established in 1878. Images of Trafalgar Studios from sort of contemporary to the time I'm talking about have proven quite difficult to come by, but here we have a similar operation, Wentworth Studios, which were built a little bit later than Trafalgar Studios in the 1880s. This photograph is of the street in around 1900s. That's Wentworth Studios. Exactly the same as the Tite Street Studios and the Trafalgar Studios, where Evelyn had space, this idea that an artist could live and work in the area. These pictures that I have found of Trafalgar Studios show them off in the 1950s. By this point, they've become pretty derelict. As you can see, there's big parts of the ceiling that have fallen down in the first image, and quite honestly, a trashed room on the right-hand side. But you can start to see, or still see, aspects of the rooms that show them off as studios. So again, these wonderful big windows in both of the rooms. On the left-hand side, you can see passages where you would walk between the individual flats that are then these self-contained units within the wider building. And on the right-hand side, again, this massive window, but then a stove on the left-hand side. So this idea that someone would be living and working in the same space. I am pretty sure that Evelyn de Morgan only worked in her Trafalgar Studios studio. Unfortunately and maddeningly, she's missing on the 1881 census, making me think that she was probably abroad, as we know that the family still had their home in North London on Bryanston Square. That was in her brother Spencer Pickering's name by 1881, as her father had passed away and Spencer had become the head of the household. Her mother and younger sister are registered as being at the family seat in Yorkshire in 1881, but Evelyn and her two brothers are missing, so probably abroad. But that is infuriating because we can't pin her to definitely still living at home. But because she doesn't appear on the census for Trafalgar Studios, I'm pretty sure she didn't live there either. She always pushed the boundaries of what should be done as a woman, but I think living in a studio that, from what I've found out so far, at the time was full of male occupants on her own, would have been a little bit too much even for her then. But hey, who knows, she might have lived there. Like I said, she was an artist who really did push the boundaries of acceptability. Here we have a more contemporary image, but obviously a painting, not a photograph of the Trafalgar Studios by an artist who I've only been able to identify as Hanson, so the surname Hanson, and this is definitely from 1886, so definitely at the same time Evelyn was working there, and this is the garden of Trafalgar Studios on Manresa Road. So an absolutely wonderful thing to have. You can imagine having that outdoor space and that natural environment, really important to the artistic life working in this area. Evelyn had number 8 Trafalgar Studios, as we've seen. The only interior image of that that I've been able to locate, unfortunately, is from much later, in 1945, and again doesn't show off too much of the room. It's sort of bit of architrave around the door, but it shows that Trafalgar Studios was still being used as studios well into the 1900s. This is 1945, and it's a picture of the bedroom by an artist called Clifford Hall. This came up for sale recently, and so we were able to obtain this image, and we know that he was in the same studio room that Evelyn had her space in. So this sort of gives you an idea of what some of the proportions of the interior of the room might have been. So big enough to have a chaise lounge and a model in there, wonderful big white walls to display some of your other artwork. And what we definitely know from this sort of turnover of artists is that this was a real community hub of lots of different artists living and working together in the same space. A very buzzy, very dynamic space to be, that I'm certain would have had an impact on the creativity of other artists working in that area. At the same time as De Morgan had studio number 8, Albert Toft, a very well-established sculptor, had rooms 11 and 12, and this is the only person I've been able to pin down to be absolutely certain would have had the space at the same time Evelyn did. So here we have one of his beautiful sculptures. He works a lot in the medium of bronze and of sculpting, and quite often will embellish his designs with precious gems and stones. But they always are these beautiful, serene women, very elongated bodies, very much in anticipation of the Art Nouveau movement that would follow. They always feel quite ahead, and that Toft was working quite ahead of the time he was in. And as we know, progressive is definitely something that Evelyn de Morgan was as well, and this is shown in the paintings that I can be certain that she made at her studio in Manresa Road at Trafalgar Studios, which is very exciting to be able to do. So the first one I'm going to talk to you about is the Dryad. Quite experimental for Evelyn de Morgan, as this is executed in oil paint on board, on a wooden board, rather than it's being painted traditionally on canvas. It's a wonderful image of this, this wood nymph, the Dryad, stepping out of the tree, aligning it very much with the myth of Pan, who was a god who would chase, in mythology, who would chase down his prey, and they disguised themselves by turning into reeds, of which he cut down and made the panpipe. So this sort of tragedy of Greek mythology. But here we have a very defiant tree nymph, covering herself up where her drapery has let her down, completely defiantly with that body language. And there's a lot of movement in there. You can't tell whether she's absorbing into the tree or emerging herself from it. We also have these brilliant symbols of renewal and rebirth, but also of Christian renewal and rebirth, which you can see in the lizard on the lower left-hand side of the trunk there. A tiny but sort of quite sweet note that sort of links this painting back to Renaissance art and that influence on De Morgan. Of course, a lizard as a skin shedder was a symbol in traditional iconography of rebirth and regrowth. Another painting from Trafalgar Studios that's signed in the bottom left-hand corner, if you squint, EP 1884, E for Evelyn Pickering, 1884. And here we have a painting called Love's Passing. We have a book open at the front of the painting here, and inscribed on the pages that we can see open one of the poet Tilibus's elegies, so one of these poems, and it's a lament, forward-looking to a time when the young couple, so much in love, would be parted by death, so till death us do part. And you can see that just over the chap's shoulder in the right hand side of the background. You see the old woman being led away by the figure of grief, or the Grim Reaper, in stark contrast to this very jubilant angel playing its sweet music to the couple on the foreground. So a brilliant image, but so full of sorrow, a real bittersweet image. And what's quite interesting about this painting is it was completed, as we know, in Chelsea in 1884, so we know that William de Morgan was still living just around the corner on Cheney Row at this time, so very close together. And it being such a huge artistic community, I'm certain that the two artists would have been moving in the same circles, and it's probable or likely that that this is sort of maybe how they ended up meeting, infamously at a fancy dress party, where Evelyn was dressed as a tube of paint called Rose Madder colour, to which William quipped he was madder still. And I just wonder, given the date of this painting and that being the similar year to their potential meeting, whether this sort of very wistful, sorrowful painting is in response to her falling for someone so much older and imagining how grief-stricken she would be at his death, being so in love with him so instantly at the time of their meeting. So that's a rather sweet and beautiful painting to include in this particular talk. Another fantastic painting by Evelyn Pickering de Morgan from the period that she was living and working in Chelsea is the C Maidens from sorry, the date's slightly wrong on that. I think it's actually 1885 to 1886, this painting. And you see we have this image based very much on Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid. We have the five sisters here coming up from the surface for a rescue mission of their sister. But this painting was bought by Mary Ann Stewart Wortley and was actually hung in their home on Tite Street. If you remember, we looked at some artist studios on Tite Street, until it was purchased purchased back by Evelyn's younger sister and came into the Foundation's collection. So a painting that very much is part of the artist's lives and legacy in artistic Chelsea. By 1885, the De Morgans had gone official and announced their engagement. And this is an excerpt from Wilhelmina Sterling, Evelyn's younger sister, from her diary from 1885, where she sort of exclaims her surprise but also delight at the De Morgans having become engaged. And you can sort of have a scan of it yourself, but it sort of picks up on the idea that Evelyn was someone who it was quite surprising would have got married. Apparently once said that she'd never do anything so foolish. But once Mr. de Morgan had been round to dinner on Sunday the 21st, probably 1885, and I don't have a month there, I'm afraid, but we like him very much, and they are due to have this long engagement. That's all been beautifully recorded in this diary. They did have a long engagement, not quite 15 years, but weren't married until 1887. This is a picture of them in their garden. I'm very sorry it's not a very good reproduction, but if you look just by the doorway, you'll see two figures in deck chairs. We've got William on the left and Evelyn on the right-hand side there. And this was their beloved home at number 1, the Vale in Chelsea, just off the King's Road. So like I said, the two of them were married in 1887, but in March 1887, the lease on this house was actually taken out by Evelyn Pickering in her maiden name in August 1886. And that gives you a bit of an idea of whose pocket the gold was in this relationship. It was definitely Evelyn that had the wealth behind her. She was a commercially successful artist. Her parents were of nobility. They were descendants from the Cook of Norfolk at Holcombe Hall, Earl of Leicester. So, real proper money that Evelyn brought to this marriage, so much so that she gifted William the sum of £4,000, which is about £300,000 in today's money, for him to develop his pottery business, move it to Sands End in Fulham from Merton Abbey, where it was at the time. And also for him to develop and open a showroom in central London rather than in Chelsea, which was on Great Marlborough Street. So she put a lot of her own personal wealth into the marriage and into her husband's business, which she really believed in the artistic value of. I think that's quite incredible because it shows her off to be a very fierce, defiant woman who knew her own mind, but had also forged her own career and amassed her own wealth through means of becoming a professional artist, just as she set out to, which is quite remarkable. Something else that's really of interest in that is that timing was very fortuitous in this relationship. In 1882, the Women's Property Act was passed, which meant that a woman could own her income that she had made herself, and that it wouldn't pass directly to her husband upon marriage, hence the reason she had to gift the money to William. But that shows a real sign of things changing for the better for these two artists. So they moved in, as I said, in 1887, and here we have the census from 1891 that shows them living at number 1, the Vale. Very hard to see, I do appreciate, but you have to trust me that they are listed there as being at number 1, the Vale. Just here, William de Morgan, Mary E, her Christian name was actually Mary, Evelyn was her middle name, and underneath that, which you can see a bit clearer on this side of the screen, we have Margaret, possibly Mackay, and Elizabeth, possibly Herbert, very difficult to read, and they are a cook and a maid. So even though William de Morgan especially quite often get, poor William, and he struggled to make ends meet, they did have 2 domestic staff who helped them at their lovely studio home at number 1, the Vale. So don't go feeling too sorry for them. Next door, if you look on here, and again over here, just about halfway up the census record, you'll see at number 2, the Vale, was Charles Ricketts, and there he is, painted by Charles Shannon in the 1880s. Charles Ricketts was an artist as well, so you know, 9 in 1,000, but actually they all lived very close together and close by each other. And next door to the De Morgans was another living practicing artist. Ricketts had come over to the UK in the 1880s and eventually set up the Vale Press. So he was an illustrator and painter, and a very successful one, and I'm certain would have been on very friendly terms with the De Morgans, then both being in the same field. For William de Morgan's health, but also for artistic reasons and to visit Evelyn de Morgan's family, from 1890 to 1914, the de Morgans spent winters in Florence. This meant anything from a couple of months up to 6 months of the year. During this time, they kept the Vale, that was their home. They rented it out to various different people, and definitely between in the winters of 1891 to 2 and 1893 to 4, the Vale, number one, the Vale was rented out by Walter Sickert, a key figure of the Bloomsbury group. And here you can see an amazing painting by him of the old Bedford, a dance hall. Sickert was very keen and interested in portraying modern culture. And the Bedford, a dance hall, like I said, was definitely part of that, especially as the new Bedford was being built at the time. He was quite keen to keep hold of that nostalgic look at London's dance halls. On the right-hand side, we have a life drawing. It's not a dragon, that's a hand. You need to turn the other way around. I thought it was a dragon the first time I saw it, but you can see on this life drawing by Sickert that in the bottom right-hand corner of the right-hand image that you're looking at, you can see it's signed Won the Vale, Walter Sickert, which absolutely pinpoints him and his artistic practice to the De Morgans' home, which in turn links them with the Bloomsbury Group and the artistic work that was going on at Camden Town. You know, they will have known Sickert, they will have known that he was using their home to teach life drawing lessons in, which he did during the time that they were spending in Italy. So it just gives, you know, it sort of puts them that one step ahead, and really as progressive artists and artists interested in new artwork and maybe supporting a younger generation as well. The De Morgans so often get caught up with the Pre-Raphaelite and arts and crafts movements, but actually with William living till 1917 and Evelyn till 1919, and both of them continuing to produce some form of artwork until their deaths, it's important to bear in mind that actually they can be pinned into the 20th century as well, and this link with the Bloomsbury group really does show that. So paintings by Evelyn de Morgan that would have been, I think, I don't actually have any solid proof on this. These paintings that I'm going to show you now were either made by the couple in Italy, or with the ones I've chosen, I think more likely at the Vale in London. Here we have Eos, or goddess of the morning, of the dawn, demonstrated by pouring this sort of wonderful dew from this upturned bottle down onto the ground below her as the sun, this beautiful golden sunrise bursts behind her. And we also have The Light Shineth in the Darkness, an exceptional drawing on dark brown paper executed in a gold cake of De Morgan's own creation into the paint. So she bought it, we know from the Robeson's accounts again, as a cake of gold or a pellet of gold pigment that she would have ground down, mixed with probably a gum arabic and an oil and a water to create her own pigment. And that really does make this wonderful image of light, which we have from the title there, shining in the darkness, and it does physically shine. On the back of that drawing, you can see a handwritten label advertising this drawing for sale from her home for £15. Now, again, no proof on this, just amusing. This very much looks to me as though the De Morgans might have had at-homes, which were quite fashionable and popular with the artistic set, in which artists would open their studios, usually on a Sunday, and invite friends, other artists, and the public in to view their artworks in their own homes and in their studios. And just with that label having a price tag and the address on the back of it, I think it's probably likely that the De Morgans, or Evelyn, definitely was selling her artwork from their home at the Vale up until they stopped living there in 1910. So we've heard a little bit about what Evelyn was up to. William was still producing tiles whilst they lived at the Vale. After his marriage, to Evelyn, and up until the Vale was destroyed in 1910. And mainly during that time, he was working at between Merton Abbey in Wimbledon, but then after his marriage to Evelyn de Morgan had moved the practice to Sands End Pottery in Fulham, at which point he also took on a business partner called Halsey Ricardo and took on bigger and more impressive commissions throughout that period. And here we have a tile panel that was part of an interior scheme for SS Malta, one of P&O's Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, who still make the very lavish cruise ships today. This commission was from P&O to decorate interior schemes of some of their most prestigious ocean liners. Travelling by sea was just the height of luxury for the upper classes at the time, and you know, that feeling of luxury and of going somewhere very exotic was shown off by having tiled interiors in dining rooms and smoking rooms for the first class cabins. And I think you really get a sense that de Morgan was trying to show off something very special and elaborate in these designs for interiors that we can see in the galleon tile panel in the de Morgan Foundation's collection. Very sadly for de Morgan, I think I've sort of mentioned that he wasn't a particularly astute businessman, and the fashions had really moved on by the turn of the century, leaving designs like the galleon tile panel feeling quite outdated. And all of this impacted upon his business, which eventually folded completely by 1907, but by 1904, production had all but stopped at the Fulham factories. This caused him quite a severe depression, and on the advice and encouragement of his wife, Evelyn, whilst they lived at the Vale, he was able to turn his hand to writing. And in 1906, he published Joseph Vance, there on the left-hand side, to wide critical acclaim. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. I think it went into 6 editions in its first year, both in the UK and the US, and turned him into quite the celebrity. Many of his obituaries mention him as a novelist or an author or a writer, and very few of them actually pick up on his artistic achievements of his earlier life at all. So whilst he was living and working in Chelsea, it was actually his books that he was much better known for by the end of his time there. And here's a list of his publications, and an article in the Sphere magazine, which shows him off as a literary genius, picking up there on his father's publications and his sister Mary's, who we've looked at as well, and really sort of lining up the de Morgans as a literary family. And a photograph that I think really sums up de Morgan's character and wit is a picture of him with his publisher, William Hyman. Hyman's the one in the middle, doing goodness knows what with his arms outstretched above some of his authors, de Morgan being the one with his hands clasped on Hyman's left-hand side as we look at the painting, at the photograph, sorry, and you know, this group of people just having an enormous amount of fun, probably in around 1910, at the time that de Morgan really is profiting quite a lot from his work as an author. So here we have probably one of the last paintings that Evelyn de Morgan would have created at their wonderful home, the Vale. It's painted in 1909, and unfortunately the Vale was demolished in 1910 to make room for other buildings on the street on that part of Chelsea. And you can see just behind William's shoulder, we have this inscription, William de Morgan, Chelsea, 1909. De Morgan's clutching one of his lustre pots. He's got his books on the shelf behind him and one of his lustre plates over his other shoulder. And in the middle we have a curtain, and it would just be wonderful if she'd opened the curtain and painted the scene behind, so we might have got a glimpse of the street or of their garden. But I am as certain as I can be that this picture was painted at their home at the Vale, at the end of many eras, the end of William's ceramic practice, the end of their time living at the Vale before they moved out to move on to the house that would see them both until the end of their lives. But a wonderful celebration of both of those artists coming together in this collaborative piece with William as sitter and his wife Evelyn as artist. And where they moved to was number 127 Old Church Street. Couldn't really be any closer to the centre of artistic Chelsea. It's about 4 doors down from Chelsea Arts Club, which was established in the 1880s to encourage artistic development and networking within the area, but also to have this fantastic annual ball. If you walk up 127, walk up Old Church Street today, you can't fail to notice the Chelsea Arts Club, because it's always painted and decorated by the members in a wonderful scheme. So it's kind of bright yellow and green at the moment. Evelyn de Morgan probably did have studio space at 127 Old Church Street. Because it's got a wonderful double aspect window. It's a big roomy property, so there's no reason why she wouldn't have worked at home, but she also had a separate studio that she could walk to. She had to walk past Turner's house that we saw at the start to get there, but also past Sylvia Pankhurst, and the practicing artist who was a suffragist, as Evelyn de Morgan and William de Morgan were. I mean, Pankhurst was a suffragette, but the de Morgans were suffragists, both signing various declarations made in favour of women's suffrage from the 1890s through to about 1914. So here we're looking at a new build of houses on the right, an old building on the left, but behind that van, yes, in an image I've stolen from Google Street View, you'll see a tiny pitched roof. That is number 17A, and it was in that building that Evelyn de Morgan had the second studio we know that she definitely had. And we're lucky enough to know that she took out this studio from a few tiny hints to it that I've ever been able to find. On the right-hand side is a catalogue of pictures that de Morgan held to benefit the British Red Cross and the Italian Cross of Rosa in 1916. And on the left-hand side, we have an advertisement for the same exhibition, which is from a suffragist magazine publication called The Vote, which obviously was also published in 1916. This just, shows how involved and interested the de Morgans were in political causes, as well as their artistic ones. Not only did this exhibition of pictures show off Evelyn's very pacifist, symbolist responses to the First World War, we'll look at a couple of those images now, but it also showed off that they were really dedicated to the campaign for women to get the vote. William was the vice president for the Men's League for Women's Suffrage by 1916, and Evelyn de Morgan was always often involved in these magazines, and her advertising, or being advertised as an artist whose exhibition was well worth going to see in such a publication, really demonstrates that. So 2 of the images that were in this exhibition, just to finish on, were ignoto, or the unknown in Latin. And here we have 2 women mourning over a grave of an unknown soldier, so an unmarked grave, obviously referencing the huge life lost and the battlefields of modern day Belgium, where the people were died and their graves couldn't be marked. So a beautiful image there. And another one, the Searchlight, which leans on the kind of contemporary technology that was emerging around the wars, this idea of a searchlight, but Evelyn de Morgan aligns that to her spiritualist beliefs and turns the searchlight not into sort of a gas light or an electric light, but turns it into this beautiful angelic figure who is enlightening those that her light turns to with this beautiful downpouring of rainbow light, whereas those who are not enlightened yet, it's sort of down here in the murky depths of the corner, but the searchlight is also firing the light forward to this demonic, horrible, fiery, bat-like creature in the top right-hand corner, and using the power of light to resist darkness, a theme that came through in so many of her paintings from this time, and this idea that there is something hopeful ahead, and that by having faith in spirituality, or faith in something bigger than ourselves, we will be able to move on and move forward and expel the evils in the world. Thank you very much for listening today. I hope you've enjoyed that whip through of artistic Chelsea and enjoyed learning a little bit more about the De Morgan's place in it. Thank you very much.